Well, I hope that by now you can look at this and identify a few structures and get yourself oriented. Shown there in a funky shade of green, that would be the medulla oblongata, the pons, the midbrain. Coursing through the midbrain there, you should be able to see the blue colored, kind of baby blue colored cerebral aqueduct going into the fourth ventricle, which goes into the central canal of the spinal cord. Posterior to that, obviously, that is the cerebellum. So you should be familiar with those structures. So we're going to move on north of there into the area of the brain called the diencephalon. The diencephalon includes that funnel-shaped purple-colored area there, basically directly behind the eyeballs, sitting immediately over the optic chiasm, having the little pink-colored pituitary gland hanging down from the infundibulum of the hypothalamus, and also to the north of that, the two hemispheres of the thalamus, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, joined by a thin band of nervous tissue called the massa intermedia. Also included in the diencephalon would be the epithalamus. The structures of the epithalamus include the pineal gland, which is the secretor of the hormone melatonin. And then again, shown there in kind of a funky shade of orange, that structure is called the habenula, part of the epithalamus. Function of the habenula is not clearly defined, but it seems to be an area where nuclei associated with aversion and avoidance behaviors originate, things that turn you off, things that disgust you, things that you simply don't want to think about or encounter again, seem to be situated there in the habenula. Okay, we will look at all of these structures in a little greater detail in the forthcoming slides. Perhaps you have noticed that a Walmart store has a manager, and the manager takes care of the day-by-day operations of the store. Who gets hired, who gets fired, what things go on the shelves, what prices do we charge during the Christmas season, who sweeps the floors and who stocks the shelves. Those are decisions made by a store manager. But you know that a store manager is answerable to the owner. Well, such is the case with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the manager of our homeostasis. So maintaining those steady state values, things like the chemistry of the blood, the water balance of the blood, the salt balance of the blood, the temperature of the blood, and the pressure of the blood. Those things are managed by these hypothalamic nuclei, but they are subject to the influence, if not the control, of the cerebral hemispheres. So the hypothalamus is the manager, but the manager is answerable to the owner. So those things can be influenced by, somewhat changed by, the power of the will. The power of the will would come from the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so what we have then is a 24-hour, 7-day a week, 365.25 days per year, manager of our homeostasis by monitoring the blood temperature, the blood pressure, and the blood chemistry is constantly monitored by the hypothalamus, and changes are executed as needed. Start here at the lower left, the supraoptic nucleus. The function there being water balance. Well, that's because it releases a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. ADH. Also, you might call it the no-no-pee-pee hormone. Well, we're managing water balance. So the hormone is released, it acts upon the kidneys and instructs the kidneys, hey, buddy, what you doing with my water? We need water in the blood, so stop spilling out my water. So that's why it's called antidiuretic. It means no-no-pee-pee. Move around there a little bit to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Suprachiasmatic means it sits over the optic chiasm. This is where we arrive at our circadian rhythm, our biological clock, if you will. That includes our sleep-wake cycle, but it includes a whole lot more than that. The timing of the secretions of hormones and the timings of metabolic activities increasing or decreasing. Those are all part of the biological clock or circadian rhythm. The suprachiasmatic nucleus seems to be in charge of that area. Find then the mammillary body. The mammillary body is a hypothalamic nucleus. The function there, feeding, that is a little bit misleading. We have another nucleus that we'll talk about in a few minutes, which is the headquarters for appetite. The mammillary body is more so involved in the formation of memories, which we will get to when we talk about limbic system structures. The ventromedial nucleus there, well, how do you know that you're full? You've had enough to eat. 12 corn dogs ought to be enough for most people. And so the ventromedial nucleus would say, hey, man, that's 12. You need to stop there. Well, if you obey the signal of satiety, then you stop eating at that time because you feel full. Actually, what's going on, the hypothalamus is monitoring the chemistry of the blood, and when we have the salt content, we have the amino acid content, we have the glucose content, we have the fatty acid content that the hypothalamus wants, then it sends out signals of saying you've had enough, stop eating. The dorsomedial nucleus there, the only function mentioned there is GI tract. Actually, the dorsomedial nucleus is more strongly known for being the nucleus of the emotion of rage. Well, once again, this is not a limbic system slide. We will get to that in a minute. This is only referring to homeostasis functions of the hypothalamic nuclei. Shivering. Shivering is a way of generating heat. So the hypothalamus is monitoring the blood temperature. If your blood goes cold for whatever reason, then you will begin shivering, and shivering generates heat. You will shiver until the temperature comes up to the level that the hypothalamus has set for your thermostat. Okay, the dorsal hypothalamic area and lateral hypothalamic area, those have functions. I don't know what they are. They're not mentioned here, so I won't say anything about them either. The paraventricular nucleus here, water balance and stress. Actually, the thing that the paraventricular nucleus is known for, it is or it has the cells which secrete the hormone oxytocin. The hormone oxytocin is the hormone that prompts the uterus to contract at the time of labor and delivery. And it also has some other interesting functions, which I will leave it up to you to look those up. My mama told me not to talk about things like that in class. Okay, on the next slide, we have a little more detail about the hypothalamic nuclei and exactly what they do. So let's just go there. The same hypothalamic nuclei that are shown on the previous slide, the functions of those nuclei are restricted to the homeostatic role that the hypothalamus plays, managing the chemistry of the blood, the pressure of the blood, the temperature of the blood, etc. But the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system also, And the limbic system is involved in things such as learning, memories, and emotions. So these same nuclei, which have a homeostatic role that they play, are also involved in limbic system functions as well. For instance, have a look at the dorsomedial nucleus, stimulation of which results in obesity. Well, that is a blood chemistry thing. Well, what about savage behavior? Well, that's a behavioral thing. So the hypothalamus has receptors that are called pleasure receptors and aversion receptors. And different things, different chemical compounds in the blood can bind at those receptors and stimulate some of what we would call primitive emotions, such as rage or what is referred to here as savage behavior. There are pleasure centers also. There are chemicals that bind at those pleasure receptors, and when they do so, a person is inclined to become addicted to those things because they stimulate pleasurable impulses in the hypothalamus. Say, that feels good. That tastes good. I like that. Hit me again. I don't want to do without that. So it can become an addictive thing. And there are lots of chemicals, there are lots of behaviors that are pleasurable. And because they are pleasurable, the hypothalamus yearns for them. It yearns to be stimulated in that way. So these same nuclei that are involved in hormonal production, homeostasis, blood chemistry maintenance, these same nuclei have these aversion and pleasure receptors, which influence a person's behavior. The primitive behaviors. I want something, therefore I will get it. Let me give you an example. I need some money. There's a bank across the street. Nobody's in the bank but some little chick, and I can handle her. So if I go in there and just knock her off, then I can take all the money I want. Well, that is a primitive impulse. Once again, we have a store manager, but the manager is answerable to the owner. We have a higher brain function, which tells us to envision the future consequences. True, I can get the money I need by robbing the bank. No one can resist me. It's just one little girl back there behind the counter. I can take care of her and I've got all the money I need. But what are the consequences? Well, I could go to jail, or the cops could show up and I could get shot. Furthermore, what if I consider who that person is? Uh, I have a sister. I wouldn't want somebody to treat my sister that way or my mama that way. So we have a higher brain to which the primitive impulses of the hypothalamus has to answer. Now, those people who are able to control themselves, well, that means they use their higher brain to override the impulses that the hypothalamus and other limbic system structures may pitch. Well, the word thalamus means the inner room. You can see that it is located right in the very middle of the brain. It consists of many different nuclei which have very diverse functions. The thalamus is best known for being the switchboard for incoming sensory signals, switchboard or distribution center. We have those ascending pathways coming up the spinal cord. The gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus come together to form the medial lemniscus. Well, those are going to the cerebral cortex, so they're going to have to pass through the thalamus. The spinothalamic tract carrying pain signals. That also will have to synapse in the thalamus. The thalamus is the switchboard to determine where those signals should be sent in the cerebral cortex. So not just coming from below the neck, but also coming from the eyes, sensory signals, coming from the tongue, sensory signals, coming from the ear, hearing or equilibrium. Also, we'll have to route through the thalamus. So the thalamus becomes the switchboard for incoming sensory signals. And those signals are sent by the thalamus to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex where they can be perceived and interpreted. So that is the best known function of the thalamus to perform that service. But there are several nuclei that are involved in other things. The thalamus is part of the limbic system, so there are learning, memory, and emotional associations or functions that go with some of these nuclei. The medial geniculate nucleus is in the hearing pathway. The lateral geniculate nucleus is in the visual pathway. So our sense of sight, our sense of hearing, has to route through the thalamus. The only sensory signal that doesn't first go to the thalamus is the sense of olfaction. Our sense of smell will go first to the olfactory cortex, which is in the inferior gyrus of the temporal lobes, but it will eventually route back to the thalamus. So, in effect, the thalamus is processing all incoming sensory signals. It is also playing a role in limbic system functions, learning, memory, and emotions. Some of the nuclei are influencers of the descending pathways. Well, the descending pathways are motor pathways coming from the motor cortex, going down toward the spinal cord. Well, those are motor signals. Well, the motor pathway goes around the thalamus. If you don't believe that, go back and look at that structure called the internal capsule. The internal capsule goes around the sides of the thalamus. It doesn't go through it. Sensory signals go through the thalamus. Motor signals go around the thalamus, but that doesn't mean the thalamus has nothing to do with motor functions. It does, because the thalamus connects to the basal ganglia. That would be the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus, and the putamen. Those nuclei influence the motor pathway. Also, the thalamus is connected to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is the coordinator, one of the coordinators of muscular movement. So the thalamus is a very complicated collection of nuclei that has a diversity of functions. On the next slide, there is a little more detail about those functions than what I've mentioned here. So have a look at that. Here's a table that kind of summarizes what I just said, the functions of the thalamic nuclei. Look at function number 1 there, which is divided into A, B, and C. So what we have is the switchboard function, incoming sensory signals, synapse in the thalamus, and the thalamus directs those signals to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex where they can be perceived and then interpreted. So 1A there, somatosensory, that is our sense of touch. We perceive sense of touch in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobes. So that area is called the somatosensory cortex. So if you feel something with your hand, then you're able to perceive that you felt something. And by way of association areas of the brain, you're able to identify it. So the somatosensory pathway, sensory signals coming up the spinal cord, signals of touch, going to be directed to the somatosensory cortex, which is the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobes. 1B, the visual pathway. Well, let's take it here. The visual pathway begins at the retina. We go through the optic chiasm. Notice that we're going to touch base there at the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Well, the lateral geniculate nucleus is in the visual pathway. Where are we going? We're going to the occipital lobe. The calcarine sulcus of the occipital lobe is the visual cortex. That's where we perceive that we have seen something. We then use association areas to identify what it is we have seen. 1C is the auditory pathway. Well, we are going to receive our auditory stimulus from the organ of Corti. The organ of Corti is innervated by the cochlear nerve. The cochlear nerve will synapse at the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. So the thalamus then directs that signal to the cerebral cortex. The auditory cortex is the superior temporal gyrus. That's the top noodle of the temporal lobes. That is where we perceive that we have heard something. So those are the sensory relay nuclei, the switchboard function of the thalamus, directing sensory signals to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex. Number 2 there, the motor relay nuclei. What I mentioned on the previous slide is that many of these thalamic nuclei are involved in influencing the motor pathways. Well, the afferent input listed there, the globus pallidus, that was one of our basal nuclei. The substantia nigra. I mentioned earlier that the substantia nigra produces dopamine. Without dopamine, a person loses the ability to move their skeletal muscles. The cerebellum. The cerebellum is the principal coordinator of movements. So the thalamus, by way of connections to the basal nuclei, the substantia nigra, the cerebellum, well, that is influencing motor functions. Well, where did the motor function come from? From the motor cortex. That is the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobes. All right, functional classification number 3 there. That is the limbic system function of the thalamic nuclei. So we have all of the limbic system structures are connected to each other. And so we're talking about emotions, we're talking about memories, we're talking about learning. So the afferent input coming into the thalamus from the hypothalamus. Well, I told you the hypothalamus has those pleasure and aversion receptors. Well, those are sensory signals. They're going to be processed in the thalamus. The amygdala is a part of the limbic system involved in fear. Fear is an emotion. People who have a diseased amygdala have no fear. Well, those are emotional things, so they are limbic system structures and functions. Okay, that'll be good. Just so you know that the thalamus has primarily the switchboard function for sensory signals, but it also influences the descending pathways, the motor pathways, and it is also part of the limbic system. Speaking of the limbic system, those structures that are shown here in blue are some of the structures that are called the limbic system. There are some others. Primarily, you would want to recognize there the fornix, the mammillary bodies, which are part of the hypothalamus. Those thalamic nuclei, which are part of the limbic system, are shown there. I mentioned the amygdala. The amygdala is associated with fear. The hippocampus, just the medial undersurface of the temporal lobes, is called the hippocampus. That is our memory processing area. It would appear that the hippocampus is necessary for initiating the activity of remembering things. It will have to go from there to the temporal lobes, but it's initiated there with the hippocampus. So we would have short-term memory, those short-term memories that become long-term memories. Apparently, the hippocampus determines which things are candidates for long-term memory. So short-term memories processed in the hippocampus, if they are to become long-term memories, then the hippocampus will have to teach those to the other areas of the brain which store long-term memories. So it's a very interesting dynamic, the process of remembering things and the hippocampus and the role it plays in that. It seems that this is done while a person is asleep. So we experience things during our waking hours. While we are asleep, the hippocampus determines what we should put in long-term memory and what we would do just as well to forget about. So the memory processing aspect there, the hippocampus teaching the temporal lobes and other memory storage areas what it thinks is important and therefore worthy of remembering. So out front, this is kind of where I started with this conversation, the medial prefrontal cortex. This is the part of our brain which is human. So we don't have just primitive things, we have human things that originate in the neurons of the medial prefrontal cortex, which is right over the eyes. Personality, judgment, envisioning of future consequences, a sense of morality, sense of right and wrong. So these are contributions made by the medial prefrontal cortex, and this is where we have to apply a sense of being human to our primitive impulses. So the urge to merge, the sexual drive that arises from the hypothalamus, that has to be controlled by the human aspect of our brain. So the frontal lobe, the medial prefrontal cortex, is where we have that power to execute judgment and envision future consequences and to operate with a sense of morality, consideration for the others that might be involved. Okay, also shown there just below the medial prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex. Oddly enough, that is an area of the brain where we combine the sense of smell, the sense of taste, and the texture of food is all combined there at the orbitofrontal complex. So we have a comprehensive appreciation for the quality of what we eat. If something tastes right but has the wrong texture, you don't get the same satisfaction out of it. Or if something doesn't smell good, you're not likely to enjoy the taste of it either. So all of those are combined there at the orbitofrontal complex. There is a very strong emotional quality to smells, and also a very strong memory of smells. So the limbic system has a lot to do with emotions. It has a lot to do with memories, and the olfactory cortex is located right there in the same area. So there's a very strong memory of smells, and there's also a very strong emotional component of smells. So those are some things that the limbic system is all about, and it's real interesting, but it's also very poorly understood. I hope that you know enough about it now that you can at least tell little sister and get her excited about it. Well, I think I got a little bit carried away on the previous slide and I kind of stole the thunder that this slide has to offer. Anyway, have a look at this because this is only the writing of what I pretty much already have said. So the functions of the limbic system and the structures are listed there for you to commit to memory. So see if you can get your hippocampus to teach your temporal lobe that these things are important because there are future consequences ahead for you. If you learn them, you will get a good grade. If you don't learn them, well, you will flunk.